In the history of warfare, there are names everyone knows: Alexander the Great, Caesar, Napoleon. But if you measure a commander's greatness by the number of defeated armies and conquered lands, they all fall into the shadow of a man whose name the West was long afraid to even utter. His name was Subutai. The son of a blacksmith with no royal blood, he became the right hand of Genghis Khan and the greatest military genius in human history. He fought over 65 major battles and lost none. He conquered 32 nations, traversing with his tumans a distance equal to half the Earth's circumference. To his enemies, Subutai was not just a general, he was a natural disaster. When European knights or Persian shahs were only beginning to gather their forces, Subutai already knew their weaknesses, their fears, and even what they would eat for breakfast. He turned war into an exact science, where chance was minimized. While others relied on personal bravery, Subutai relied on mechanics, flawless intelligence, incredible movement speed, and discipline that turned thousands of horsemen into a single lethal organism. Imagine an army that moves faster than the rumors of its approach can spread, an army that appears simultaneously from 3 directions where no one expected it. Today, on War Mechanics, we break down the Subutai Code. We will learn how a blacksmith's son from the distant steppes managed to hack the defense systems of entire continents, and why his strategies are still studied in the world's elite military academies. This is the story of a man who owned the world while remaining in the shadow of the Great Khan. In the world of war mechanics, information was always worth more than gold. Most generals of the past only began to think about the enemy when they saw their banners on the horizon. Subutai acted differently. For him, war did not begin with the first arrow shot, but 2, 3, and sometimes 5 years before the first Mongol rider crossed the enemy's border. Subutai had eyes that saw everything, and those eyes never closed. His intelligence network was the first prototype of a global secret service in history. His agents were those whom no one suspected: merchants, wandering monks, traveling performers, and caravanners. While they traded silk or spices in the markets of Europe, Persia, or Rus, they gathered data that Subutai transformed into detailed maps. He knew not only the number of enemy soldiers, but also the exact condition of roads, the availability of river crossings, and, most importantly, he knew the political cracks within states. Subutai masterfully played on the hatred between princes and kings, knowing exactly who would betray an ally and who would prefer to sit behind walls while their neighbor was burned to the ground. Imagine the scale of this operation. In Subutai's headquarters, data was analyzed for thousands of kilometers ahead. When the Mongols entered a new country, they already had guides from among local traders or intimidated captives. They had precise data on where the best pastures for their horses were and which cities held grain supplies. This was not a wild horde wandering in search of loot. It was a high-precision instrument moving along pre-planned routes. Often, Subutai's victory was achieved before the battle even began. By the time an enemy king received news of an attack, Subutai's agents were already spreading rumors, sowing panic, and bribing key military leaders. This mechanic of total espionage made Subutai a ghost. He always knew more about the enemy than the enemy knew about themselves. It was this informational power that allowed him to make decisions that seemed like magic or supernatural intuition to his contemporaries, though in reality it was cold calculation based on flawless data. If intelligence was Subutai's eyes, then his battlefield tactics were a trap from which there was no escape. The most famous and deadly technique in his arsenal was the feigned retreat. At first glance, this seems like a simple trick, but in the execution of Subutai's tumans, it was a complex mechanism requiring iron discipline and perfect timing. The trap's mechanics worked like this. The Mongol vanguard would engage in battle, imitate panic, and begin a disorderly retreat. To the knights of Europe or the heavy cavalry of the East, this looked like a long-awaited victory. Blinded by the excitement of the chase, the enemies would break their formation and rush after the fleeing nomads. But they did not know that every meter of this pursuit was pre-calculated. The Mongols could simulate flight for days, luring the enemy dozens of kilometers deep into their territory, to where the main striking force awaited them. When the pursuers were finally exhausted and their ranks stretched and turned into a chaotic mob, Subutai would give the signal. At the sound of a horn or the wave of a banner, the fleeing Mongols would instantly wheel around. At that same moment, fresh units of heavy cavalry would crash down on the bewildered enemy from ambushes on the flanks and rear. The enemy's overextended and tired formation instantly became a target for execution. Subutai didn't just defeat the enemy, he forced the enemy to defeat themselves. He used their own pride, their heavy armor, and their thirst for glory against them. The most striking example of this mechanic is the Battle of the Kalka River, where Russian and Cuman princes chased Subutai for 9 days, only to find themselves in a deadly encirclement. This wasn't just a trick, it was an algorithm where every rider knew their role, and any enemy attempt to impose their own battle scenario shattered against the cold calculation of the great general. Subutai's offensive was not a spontaneous raid, it was a triumph of logistics and operational planning. In 1241, during the invasion of Europe, Subutai executed a plan that even today seems impossible without satellite communication. He divided his army into 5 separate corps. They entered Europe across a front 1,000 kilometers wide, stretching from Poland to Transylvania. What is the mechanics behind this? 5 columns moved along different routes, solving 3 problems simultaneously. First, logistics. A massive concentration of cavalry cannot follow a single road. Horses need grazing land, and soldiers need forage. Second, disinformation. The enemy could not discern where the primary blow would land and was forced to splinter their own forces. Third, total control. Subutai created an information vacuum for the enemy by eliminating all messengers and scouts in their path. But the most striking element was the assembly point. After hundreds of kilometers of marching through mountain passes and dense forests, all corps had to converge in the Danube Valley at the exact same time. A mistake of even 2 days would mean being defeated in detail. But Subutai did not make mistakes. Coordination was achieved through the YAM system, a network of mounted couriers capable of transmitting orders across hundreds of kilometers per day. This is the mechanics of distributed intelligence. Each commander of 10,000 knew the overall objective, but possessed the autonomy to make tactical decisions. Subutai was not a micromanager, he was an architect. He set the tempo and the vector, while his commanders operated like finely tuned gears. While European kings were still struggling to assemble their levies, Subutai had already calculated the time and place of their demise. He viewed the theater of operations not as a map, but as a timeline of force vectors, where victory was simply the result of these vectors intersecting at the precise moment. April 1241. Subutai launches the final phase of his European program. It was a masterpiece of strategic synchronization. 2 decisive battles, Legnica and the Sajo River, took place just 2 days apart at a distance of 500 kilometers. This eliminated any possibility of mutual aid between the European monarchs. First, Legnica. The Northern Corps under Baidar and Kadan faced the flower of Polish chivalry and the Teutonic Knights. Here, the Mongols demonstrated the mechanics of tactical isolation. Using smoke screens and psychological pressure, they severed the link between the infantry and Henry the Pious's heavy cavalry. When the knights charged, they did not find a frontal collision, they entered a fire sack. The Mongols did not engage in fair combat, they decimated European pride from a distance, leveraging their advantages in rate of fire and mobility. Legnica was not a battle, it was the systematic liquidation of Europe's northern shield. 2 days later, the Battle of the Sajo River, Mohi. The main forces of Subutai and Batu blocked King Bela IV. Here, the mechanics of war shifted toward engineering superiority. The Hungarians entrenched themselves in a fortified camp, believing the river and a narrow bridge were their protection. Subutai turned their fortress into a mass grave. At night, the Mongols established a crossing downstream using rafts and bundles of brushwood, a maneuver the Hungarians deemed impossible due to the spring floods. Simultaneously, Subutai deployed heavy stone-throwing engines brought from China to suppress the bridge's defenses. This marks the first instance in European history where artillery preparation was used to seize a bridgehead. The most brutal element of Subutai's mechanics was the Golden Bridge. He intentionally left a gap in the encirclement. When the Hungarian host, seized by panic, rushed into this corridor, they ceased to be an army and became targets. The pursuit lasted 6 days. Subutai did not merely win, he erased the Hungarian military as an organized structure. This was total war, where the logic of annihilation took precedence over the chivalric toad. Europe was pried open like a tin can, and it possessed no remaining instruments of resistance. At the threshold of 1242, defenseless Central and Western Europe lay before Subutai. Vienna, Paris, and Rome were merely logistical objectives on his roadmap. But the mechanics of the empire worked in reverse. The death of the great Khan Ogadai in distant Karakoram forced the machine to halt. Subutai, being the perfect instrument of state will, turned the Tumans back. Europe was saved not by the valor of its knights, but by the Mongol law of succession. If we summarize Subutai's career, we see figures that defy the logic of a human biography. 65 pitched battles, 32 nations conquered, 0 defeats. He rose from a blacksmith's son to the de facto commander-in-chief of the largest contiguous land empire in history. But his true legacy lies not in territorial gains. Subutai invented operational art 700 years before the term appeared in general staff manuals. He was the first to realize that modern warfare is not a collection of heroic duels, but the management of information, resources, and time flows. His strategy of the deep operation, striking across the entire depth of the enemy's formation and dismantling their command system, would become the foundation for Blitzkrieg doctrines and Soviet deep battle concepts of the 20th century. Subutai was the living processor of the Mongol war machine. While other generals relied on intuition or divine providence, he relied on calculation. He transformed the army into an algorithm where every maneuver was mathematically justified. His gritty realism lay in the fact that he never sought a fair fight. He sought a way to make resistance physically impossible. At the end of his life, this man who held 2 continents in terror simply returned to his yurt near the banks of the Toul River. He died at the age of 73, leaving behind a world he had reshaped under the hooves of his horses. In Western history, his name remained in the shadow of Genghis Khan for a long time because he was too efficient. He did not leave surviving chroniclers behind. He left behind a void and a perfectly executed mission. Subutai is the very definition of war mechanics in its purest, coldest, and most perfect form. Process complete, objective achieved.